All right, there are people coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and start. Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. My name is Carol Cohn, and I am the director of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you in the audience and all of our speakers to today's webinar on new economic paradigms for peace and the planet, intersectional perspectives. I want to mention that while I'm introducing the webinar, if any of you who are Zooming in to join us would like to introduce yourselves, the chat box is open and it would be great to hear from you. When I turn to the panelists to start speaking, the chat will be off until the end, the last few minutes of the webinar. And then if you'd like to take some time to share resources or reflections, that would be wonderful. So just to give you a little sense of what will happen today, the webinar is scheduled for 2 hours. First, the panelists will each offer some opening remarks of 10 minutes each. We'll then have about 40 minutes of discussion amongst the panelists, during which time I'll pose some questions, and then we will turn to questions gathered from the audience. So please, at any time during the talks, please feel free to put questions into the Q&A function. At the very end, each panelist will have time for a brief closing reflection. And also please note that when you exit, you will get a brief pop-up survey, and we'd really be grateful if you could take a couple of minutes to fill it in. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available online at our website and our YouTube channel. So if you missed anything or really want to tell your friends how wonderful it was, you can send them over to it. As you all know, in addition to the generosity of our speakers in sharing their time with us, an event like this cannot happen without many different kinds of support. For today's panel, as with the whole rest of the speaker series, we especially want to thank the many departments and programs at UMass Boston who have sponsored the webinars, and you'll see them listed in your program. And I'd also like to thank the consortium staff and interns who worked hard to prepare today's event, including, excuse me, Katie Rose Parsons, Taylor Douglas, Lauren Nishimuta, and Melissa Kay, our project manager, who not only dealt with all of the logistics and planning, but also played a huge role in conceptualizing, researching, and designing this spring's webinar series. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to take a moment for a land, labor, and life acknowledgement, which is in many ways inspired by the thoughtful model of UMass professor Sindiso Manisi Weeks. It is central to our understanding of what the consortium's work is all about to acknowledge the land upon which the University of Massachusetts resides as an honoring of Indigenous peoples' relationships with their traditional territories and as a recognition of ongoing colonial violence against both these peoples and their territories. UMass Boston and its surrounding communities are the ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and Nipmuc people. We want to acknowledge the violent history of genocide and forced removal from this territory and honor the Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. And we also want to note that land acknowledgements like this really need to be just one small step, a beginning, and need to be followed by gaining more knowledge, by action building solidarity, and combating the ongoing structural and physical violence directed toward Indigenous peoples. And I just want to note that Northwestern University's Native American and Indigenous Initiatives website has a lot of really good resources for thinking about what do you do after an acknowledgement? What are the next steps? Also, following Sindiso, I want to acknowledge that the United States, like many other countries, has been built on the enslaved labor of Black and Brown people, and to acknowledge that the physical and cultural violence and white supremacy underpinning the institution of slavery are ever present in this country today, as we are reminded of so painfully every day by events in the news. Dwayne Wright being only the latest. And finally, especially in this time of pandemic and the rise in already long-standing anti-Asian violence in this country, as well as increasing xenophobia, I also want to honor the contributions of waves of immigrants who came and daily come to this country as a free choice, often when the violence, poverty, and environmental degradation in their home countries hewn through hundreds of years of colonial and imperial relationships, have left them few other choices. All of these populations, Indigenous, Black and Brown, Asian, and other marginalized communities, have not only long faced structural racism and physical and structural violence, but also epistemological violence, the attack on their knowledges, their skills, their values and worldviews as inadequate, primitive, inferior, wrong, irrelevant, something to be shed in the name of so-called progress. Our speaker series this spring and the consortium's Feminist Roadmap for Sustainable Peace and Sustainable Planet project, of which the speaker series is a part, are in part a response to that attempted erasure I just spoke of, and an acknowledgement that the colonial, racist, patriarchal, capitalist knowledges, paradigms, and policies that have led us to the brink of climate and eco-catastrophe are not going to provide the solutions. We need to look elsewhere, starting with those marginalized and suppressed knowledges, starting with the voices that do not usually get the space that they deserve to speak. So that was the purpose of our fall symposium on confronting the climate crisis, feminist pathways to just and sustainable futures, and of our spring speaker series. We had 3 other wonderful events in the speaker series so far, and I really encourage you to find them on the consortium's website if you missed them. Now, finally, turning to the matter at hand, it is a great privilege for me to be hosting today's panel on new economic paradigms for peace and the planet, intersectional feminist perspectives. We have wonderful speakers today. I'll introduce each just before she speaks, and we'll keep the intros short, as in Zoom world, you can all find lots more information about each of them online. Our first panelist today is Karina Dengler. She's a feminist ecological economist and degrowth scholar, activist based in Bremen, Germany. She studied economics, development studies, socio-ecological economics and policy in Vienna, Moscow, and Quito, an interesting combination. From March 2017 onward, she worked as a research assistant at the University of Vecta, where in 2020, she finished her PhD titled Feminist Futures, What Degrowth Learns from the Feminist Critique of Science, Economics, and Growth. Just March, she transferred to the University of Kassel as a senior lecturer in the Master's Global Political Economy and Development program. Her research focuses on the intersection of feminisms and the environment, heterodox economics with a focus on feminist and ecological economics, as well as the political economy of resource extraction in Latin America and its connections to growth/degrowth. So the title of her remarks today is Our Degrowth is Intersectional, Feminist Decolonial Pathways for Sustainable Futures. And I now turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation to this panel. I'm really honored to be here, and also for your kind introduction, Carol. So to start off with, as you have already heard in Carol's introduction, like I'm not a peace scholar, like in the narrow sense. So while I'm looking forward to all the expertise here in the room, I'm going to focus more on how we need a new economic paradigm for planetary and human flourishing and for building sustainable peace. That's what I was thinking about in the first place. But then I was going back to Rachel Carson, who has been, who was a founding mother of feminist environmentalism in the US, as most of you probably know. And what she has been saying in her groundbreaking book, Silent Spring, and I'm quoting this, is, that's a question as whether any civilization can wage relentless war on life without destroying itself and without losing the right to be called civilized. So here we see once again that those perspectives are really closely interlinked. So instead of talking about political warfare, maybe I'll be talking about the war on life that is arising from an economic system that depends, it structurally depends on the exploitation of nature on the one hand, and on the exploitation of unpaid care work or reproductive work, which is mostly carried out and performed by women, or generally people discriminated against in terms of, for example, race, class, and gender on the other. So that's one of the core theses that my work is building on. It's a core thesis that has been brought forward by ecofeminists, by feminist ecological economists, and by feminist political ecologists, that basically when we're talking about the economy as economists, very often we're only talking about one very small tip of an iceberg, if we want to use this iceberg metaphor by Maria Mies. So basically this tip of the iceberg, it's what's counted in GDP, it's a monetized economy. And this economy is, however, based upon a much larger foundation, a foundation that consists, for example, of nature on the one hand, and of unpaid care work. There could be no production processes at all in the monetized economy without, on the one hand, the devaluation of reproductive labor, and on the other hand, the destruction of nature. And I think even now, like in the COVID-19 pandemic, we can see once more, like it supports this feminist arguments that the whole wealth and well-being of the world is really very fundamentally built up on this invisibilized and feminized sphere of both social and ecological reproduction. So I think we need to acknowledge that we're living really in a multiple and very much interlinked and overlapping crises, which are further exacerbated during the pandemic. So we're living through a climate crisis, or more broader, maybe an ecological crisis, but also through economic crises, crises of democracy, of inequality, of care, of wars and militarization. And very obviously now, such a multidimensional crisis also needs multidimensional strategies, and then looking to really find transformative solutions to such a complex crisis system. I think it is very clear that we need an economic system that prioritizes people and planet over profit, and that fights an economic system which is growth dependent and structurally based on extractive capitalism, on white supremacy, on coloniality, and on patriarchy. So in my perspective, degrowth, it's an academic discourse and a social movement that precisely tries to bring about a new economic paradigm, a paradigm shift, so to say, that is built around the sustainability of life. So for those of you who maybe hear for the first time today about degrowth, I'm just gonna briefly raise some points what degrowth is, or rather what degrowth is not, because there are many times, like there are some common misunderstandings. So first, the first thing I want to raise is that degrowth is not growth, negative growth within a growth paradigm, which would, we all know that, be a recession, but rather it precisely says that we need to liberate ourselves as individuals, but also our institutions at the meso and our economy at the macro level and society from this growth imperative, from this imperative to always have to grow. So in these terms, degrowth is not a recession, but it tries to radically challenge the ecological untenability of our economic paradigms that sees growth as good, as imperative, as essentially limitless, and as also as a solution to all kind of social problems. And the next thing I want to say is that degrowth is not a purely economic concept. So it's more an inter and transdisciplinary call for socio-ecological transformation based on inter and intragenerational justice. And the third point I want to raise, it's 5 points I brought you. The third point I want to raise is that degrowth is not across the board degrowth. So when we're talking about degrowth, it's not about degrowth that concerns every sector of the economy or every world region equally, but it very obviously concerns some certain sectors more than others. For example, it concerns coal or fracking much more than it does the care sector. So most degrowthers would say like the care sector, also the renewable energy sector. There we need selective qualitative growth and flourishing actually. And obviously also it concerns certain world regions or people more than others, like it concerns global elites, but it doesn't concern, for example, Zapatistas in Chiapas in Mexico. So the fourth point is that degrowth is not about joyless renunciation, like we cannot have all this consumption anymore, but it's really about trying to radically reassess of what actually contributes to our own subjective well-being, which we can see in a lot of empirical studies that for many people, they're saying, like, for me, more time sovereignty would be much more worse than, for example, always more money and ever more consumption. And the last point, because I don't want to end on the consumption level, because I think that degrowth is very explicit about that it, like, there is no point in trying to solve a systemic crisis on an individual basis. So it's not about green consumption maybe, but it's really about a repoliticization of the ecological crisis. And it's about this question of what is actually a good life for all, and who is all, and who is we actually. So it's a repoliticization of this question that has to be negotiated collectively. So to summarize, maybe degrowth is a broad, inter, and also transdisciplinary call, because like many degrowth, it's both within scholarship and activism. So it's a broad, inter, and transdisciplinary call that has, like, at its core, that it's trying to create human well-being within planetary boundaries. And in our times of a repoliticization of the ecological crisis in many parts of the world, degrowth envisions a transformation to a socially just and environmentally sound system, like as a big utopia in a way, and then also envisions like small steps towards this horizon. So my PhD research was on what degrowth learns from the feminist critique of science, economics, and growth. And the feminism I'm embracing there is decidedly intersectional. And I think some of the core messages I wanted to bring across is that degrowth actually opens a window of opportunity for also feminist futures, but there's no automatism. Like, degrowth really needs to embrace intersectional feminism. It really needs to go beyond just repoliticizing the climate crisis, and really needs to see how all those crises are interlinked in order to really try to have a new holistic transformative economic paradigm. So I guess the point I was trying to make is that degrowth, it emerged from ecological growth critique, but we cannot just single out so destructive societal relations with nature. But we really need to see, like, sometimes one has to focus on a struggle, but we really need to see how all those crises I've been talking about are heavily interlinked. And therefore, degrowth needs to, and I think it does, mostly also embrace feminism, decoloniality, anti-racism, and I think also anti-capitalism. So I think in this sense, it's so important to talk about allyship in degrowth, like embracing allyship. Like, we can focus on some fights on socio-ecological transformation, but we need to be also good allies to, for example, Black Lives Matters, to feminist mobilizations like Ni Una Menos and Vivas Nos Queremos in Latin America, or to the Kurdish liberation movement. And I think, like, I think that degrowth, it's one debate, one transition debate, and I think it's an important one, because it really focuses on the fact that we cannot create human and planetary flourishing within planetary boundaries and an economic system based on growth and extractive capitalism. But I think, like, this interconnectedness is something I really want to talk about more today. So that's really like a precondition for building a sustainable new economic paradigm. I'm at the end of time, and I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for bringing Rachel Carson back in. I feel like we all need to reread Rachel Carson once every few months. And thank you too for this really useful introduction to degrowth and the ways in which the urgency for us bringing a certain kind of both intersectional political analysis into it and thinking about the kinds of alliances that need to be central to it. So thank you for all of that. It is now my pleasure to go on and introduce our second speaker, Patricia or Ellie Perkins. She's professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Toronto, where she teaches climate justice, ecological economics, community economic development, climate change policy, and critical interdisciplinary research design. Her recent research focuses on feminist ecological economics, climate justice, commons, and participatory governance. And she's currently working with community members in the Jane Finch community near York University on ethical research procedures and equitable access to knowledge produced. In addition to many journal articles and book chapters, she's the author of Local Activism for Climate Justice, The Great Lakes Watershed from Routledge, and she currently directs a project which is building a network of African and Latin American researchers working on climate justice, ecological economics, and commons governance. She's the lead author for Chapter 5 on demand, services, and social aspects of mitigation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report, which will be published in 2020. Today, she will be talking about envisioning the decline of patriarchy, race, and capitalism. And I'm sure you're going to get that down in 10 minutes. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Ellie.
Thanks, Carol. That IPCC report is not out yet, so that I should have updated that. It'll hopefully be out later this year. So it's such an honor and a privilege to be with you today. And I think what we're trying to do is we're daring to dream together about humanity's future, or what Indigenous climate scholar Kyle White calls collective continuance. I'm speaking to you from the North Shore of Lake Ontario in Toronto, territory which is the homeland of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Adirondack, and Huron-Wendat nations. The Mississaugas of the Credit are the current treaty holders of the area around Toronto, where I live. I acknowledge and thank them for caretaking this land and sharing their wisdom about how to do so. I acknowledge also that First Nations continuance and resurgence opens a responsibility for visitors on the land like me to respond with respect and humility. We need to keep trying, learning, and listening. When I quote and refer to Indigenous ideas, stories, and writing here in this presentation and otherwise, I do not mean to take voice, but instead to call attention to them and encourage you to read those writers in their own words. I think that the more we listen and learn about what is wrong with the world today, sharing academic and activist knowledge and lived experience and naming the problems in their intersections, the more prepared we are to envision a better future. I would like to share some ideas about ways of working for a world free from patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and racism all at once, since those words all name aspects of the same cul-de-sac, which I hope humanity can and will be able to step past. Because these isms, built by humans, are mutable social structures. So here are some books which for me contain foundational thoughts. Nancy Fulbray says patriarchy is on the decline, mainly because its hierarchies refuse to sustain care and social well-being. Rinaldo Walcott, a colleague here in Toronto, sharing his perspective as a Black descendant of enslaved people who were themselves property, says owned property itself, both private and public, is a big part of our current conceptual impasse. And Walcott notes that commons, meaning collectively organized and defended means of livelihood, link to the idea of social well-being. But on colonized land, And in a still colonial and extremely inequitable world, whose commons is parallel to whose justice and whose care as crucially important questions. Glenn Coulthard, in his book, Red Skin, White Masks, has also pointed this out, that commons on colonialized land is a problem. You know, we have to work through this. For commons to function, especially while embedded in or surrounded by capitalist structures, this requires not just decolonizing preconditions, but also very strong social institutions to defend those commons. And how to build this in non-racist, decolonial, non-patriarchal, respectful, sustainable ways that address the need for reparations, care, and repair demands ongoing experimentation. And this is one of the things that Craig Fortier talks about in his book, Unsettling the Commons. Indigenous scholars Kyle White et al. Speak of trust,
yes, I'm here.
gender, and redundancy as qualities of relationships that enable reciprocity and stewardship in Indigenous knowledge systems, which echoes their role in ecosystem dynamics that enable Indigenous futurity and resurgence. This is a non-colonial understanding of sustainability, and also a reminder of the effects of ongoing colonial oppression. Indigenous governance institutions that have endured for thousands of years without overstepping their ecological bounds, embedding ecological care, socio-political controls on the hubris and wealth of leaders, and stabilizing feedbacks of many other kinds as well, are described by Indigenous ecological economists. And Ronald Trosper's book is a really good example of that. The current crises driven by Western and Northern thought and its manifestations, including capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, which have nearly destroyed wiser ways of living lightly on the earth, as Carol said earlier, are understood by political philosophers and thinkers like Boaventura de Souza Santos, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, and many others, in fact, as epistemological and ontological in origin, as Carol also pointed out just now. And Boaventura says, resistance must be conceived of as a global insurgent classroom, which is a phrase I like. So at the grave risk of simplification, I dared, yes, a few days ago, to try to draw a constellation diagram of these ideas. The transformation that most of the intersectional sources I've quoted see as already underway includes care for all, commons not property, and stabilizing governance institutions as core elements of what's happening and what needs to happen. By stabilizing governance institutions, I mean cultural, social, and political processes which actually have the effect of controlling leaders' greed, impunity, and also thus the tendency towards concentration of wealth and power. Undoing colonialism, patriarchy, and racism they're all key means towards the central goal of resurgence of shared well-being. This transformation includes land back to Indigenous peoples' collective control. It includes money, local money created by and for local communities for their benefit. And it also includes attention and purposeful increased diversity in institutions, governance processes, cultures, and pathways forwards. And that includes educational institutions, of course. So this slide actually summarizes the words so far, but I would also like to mention two more important words, which are equity in relation to peace. From the Western historical perspective, taken by Walter Scheidel in another of those books that I showed in an earlier slide, his recent book, The Great Leveler, says that the only instances when wealth has been drastically equalized in what he calls recorded history have been in times of war, revolution, famine, and or plague. That is extreme violence and catastrophe for nearly everyone, with the poor bearing the most terrible impacts. Rich individuals simply have more to lose, so wealth becomes more equally distributed during such crises. This view is too extreme, according to some other male writers who point to labor unions, Scandinavian-style social policy, and other promising peaceful ways of advancing equity bit by bit. But as we know, inequity has increased so dramatically since the 1970s, both locally and globally, and especially during the pandemic, that the politics of peaceful transformation are being destabilized. So I believe this is another way to see the urgency of focusing on care, commons, and the social mechanisms of building stable governance systems to protect livelihoods and well-being for all. So Carol mentioned in her introduction some of the things that I'm working on now, and I'll just go through this very quickly, but this project focusing on climate justice, commons governance, and ecological economics with scholars in a number of countries is one of the things that I'm doing now. And the book that I published, that I edited, that was published last year, Local Activism for Global Climate Justice, the Great Lakes Watershed. Both of these things talk about and try to put into practice international relationships and communication around how the climate crisis is affecting all of us in different ways, and how education and political activism and building the local networks can lead to, hopefully lead to that steps towards that stabilizing governance that that I was mentioning before. The Climate Justice Partnership expects the scholars to do participatory research with local organizations. This helps to make their research immediately relevant and increase the agency of people who often are not included in decision-making, but have very vast amounts of lived experience and knowledge about how governance can be improved. And I think that these are promising ways to move forward. At least it's what I can do as an academic. The partners are in Brazil, Chile, South Africa, Mozambique, Cameroon, Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. And the local level project on research ethics in the Jane Finch community, which surrounds the York University campus, is also about bringing the voices of people who are often excluded from decision-making and from even access to knowledge about and research results about their own community, bringing them in and including them in processes of decision.
Ellie, I'm so sorry to jump in.
Yes, I'm just about done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Networking with feminist ecological economists and women working hard at the community level everywhere has always been the source of strength, inspiration, friendships, and energy for me over decades of collaboration. And I think today's discussion shows this power. So thank you so much. Sorry, Melissa, if I went over.
Thank you so much, Ellie. It was a wonderful presentation, and I think you're both, I really appreciate you raising up the voices that you did in the beginning, and I think your daring diagram is going to leave us with a lot to be thinking about. And now it's my pleasure to turn to our third panelist, Leibohong Diapol, Capo. And she is an activist scholar, public intellectual, senior strategist, and movement builder. Her research interests are in African political economy, states and nationhood, international trade and global financial governance, feminization of poverty, regional integration, and impacts of globalization on labor migration. She's the Senior Research Fellow at the Research and Policy Advocacy think tank Trade Collective, and she's taught international trade and developed a course on African feminism. She's also taught at universities in Mexico, Sweden, Kenya, the UK, Germany, and the US, and has lived and worked across 42 different countries. Her work is grounded in a race, class, and feminist analysis, and she is committed to grounding academic research in community struggles and contexts. She's also the owner of Four Rivers, a company that consults in economic policy analysis, impacts of international trade, entrepreneurship, development, and market trends. She's a board member of several academic and development organizations, including the International Network on Migration and Development and Wellbeing Economy Research Network, African Trade Practitioners, Network of Women Economists, South African Women in Dialogue, clearly a very busy woman. She has contributed to several books on international trade, international development, politics, and feminist studies, and published widely, and is considered a leading exponent on the African political economy, international trade, and African development. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce her and her talk today, which will be on addressing COVIDnomics and its implications to transform the world from an African feminist perspective. Over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you to my co-panelists as well, Corinna, Ellie, and Mariama. It's always great to be in great company, and I'm deeply honored to have this platform. I also want to situate myself within the context of settler capitalism and settler colonialism. I think I'm kind of mirroring back what both Carol and Ellie said. And I think that as a person whose land has been occupied and continues to be occupied, I cannot state strongly enough how important it is to excavate Black and brown struggles globally, but to also appreciate the ongoing ontological, epistemological, ecological, political, and economic and psychosocial damage that is down to this ongoing extractive occupation and the various ways that it takes. And I think that's exactly where I would like to dovetail into my remarks. So basically to say firstly that of course South Africa has given the world many important constructs on race-based capitalism, and many of us have also then augmented that now with a very sharp analysis and an important anti-imperial analysis of race-based capitalism and the way in which feminism and African feminism are able to respond to them. The extractivism that I spoke to you about is not only a physical extractivism, although that is the one important pillar. It begins with the land and it ends with the land, and that is a personal and a political motto, and everything that is represented by land. So as a means of production, as a place of rest, a place of peace, there's also a spiritual and psychosocial relationship between ourselves and the land. It is also a space where we often relate to and commune with those who have gone, an expectation of those who are yet to come. So land is sacred and land is important. Now, if we then link this and fast forward this to the COVID moment and the many different ways in which biopolitics, biogeography, and race-based geography, racist geography are also playing themselves out in the context of social distancing, in the context, particularly on a continent where many people do not have easy access to water, to sanitation, to housing, do not have easy access to socially distance, do not in fact have easy access to the kind of mechanisms that make it quite simple for these sorts of fora to take place. I think that what the COVID-19 pandemic has done is that it's exposed the ongoing weaknesses of capitalism as an economy and as a polity, as an idea. So capitalism not just as a system, as a systemic structured way of extracting the most amount of labor, the most amount of natural or other resources for the least amount of money, but it's also revealed that there's a huge potential of post-capitalism or otherwise capitalism, a capitalism that we should just dispose of in every way, shape, or form. I don't believe that capitalism can be reformed. I don't think that it should brush its teeth and put on makeup and be recycled and build back better. I just think the thing needs to fall. And I think we should really be talking about building forward radical. So what many African feminist scholars, activists, researchers have collectively been critiquing, particularly quite a lot of us over the past 12 months are the current market orthodox models of macro and microeconomics made with ongoing forms of colonialism, including the colonization of natural resources, the colonization of the economy, the colonization of political relations, the colonization of healthcare and health provision, all of which have come to this apex of crisis right now. So really, COVID-19 is really not a new crisis. It's a crisis upon crisis. It's an ongoing pandemic, and it is really a calling card of the despair, the disrepair, and the sort of fragility that global capitalism has actually been standing on for a very long time. Pity that it managed to resurge and reinvent itself after 2008. And I am hopeful that in this moment, we'll be able to have the tools of engagement to rethink states, to rethink economies, to rethink markets, and to rethink ecologies. I think what African decolonial feminism, which is the school of thought that I belong to very firmly, has also contributed to and is drawing on. And I really appreciate the previous speakers' remarks on degrowth, on anti-colonialism, on race and patriarchal states and patriarchal economies, right? Is that it also offers the politics of well-being economics and degrowth, which are extremely useful in this time. Now that we've been confronted with this immense impact of the current pandemic, there seems to be no option except to promote the resurgence of state planning that is anchored in feminist relational reimagining. So I think that one of the most important contributions that we're making in this time as women and as feminists across the world, and the Global South being quite an important foci for this, is that it reminds us of the politics and of the economics of the everyday things. And what really has happened is that, of course, the rational man, usually the rational white man based in the global north, has been mystified and has been mythologized as the rational person, as the economic unit. And yet that's not at all what the rational man actually is. The rational man doesn't actually exist. The rational person is actually me, it's actually you, it's actually us. It's actually backbreaking to participate in the economy. It's actually backbreaking to reconstruct and deconstruct what care economics, or rather social reproduction, and the work and the time that it takes to participate concurrently in both market and social reproduction needs to be valorized. Now that most of us are working from home with children of different hair colors as well, around us, we're seeing how difficult it is to manage all of this stuff. I'm only blessed that my children are big people, pretty much adults, who are able to manage themselves. But I can't imagine what it's like to be with toddlers, to be with elderly people, to be with people who might need some differentiated form of care and attention. And for the market to pretend that this is casual work and that this is leisure work is really one of the great fallacies. Anybody who's read some of the conventional market orthodoxy is aware that activities like breastfeeding, like shopping, like doing laundry, none of this is fun stuff, by the way, are considered to be acts of leisure. And what is happening in this moment is that we are reconstructing what work is, and we're making demands on a reconstruction of what the economy actually is. It's really important that we not be naive or underestimate the determination of white Western paternalistic neoliberal governance. And no change is going to come without really fearless resistance. It's also important, I think, for me, in terms of my own personal and political positionality over and above my academic proclivities, is to note that decoloniality can also be colonized, so that the language of appropriation of terms, of constructs, and even of warfare, of the kind of resistance to different economies. It's very important that, we've already seen words like sustainable development becoming, meaning nothing. We've already seen greenwashing. We've already seen the ways in which the market orthodoxy has managed to appropriate terms, even appropriate some of our best thinkers in some respects. And I think that this is how I really appreciate the previous remarks that were made about respectful remembrance and respectful allyhood, which is not a usurpation of the struggles of Black and brown people and Black and brown women in my case. So while much of the focus so far has been on the original epicenter of the outbreak, first China, then Europe, and then later the US and Brazil, we're also aware that many people in the global South are bearing the long-term effects in even more horrific ways. And I think South Africa, as you're all very well aware, has been well publicized as the epicenter of the coronavirus on the African continent for reasons which are a bit too complex to go into right now. But countries in the global South, we were already struggling in relation to economic disparities, patriarchal infrastructure, a lack of really well-defined social infrastructure, very limited access to healthcare, clean water, electricity, in addition to large-scale unemployment. But I think even that the construct of what work means, as I mentioned before, needs to be shifted, because when we speak about work in the African context and most parts of the global South, we're really talking about your 9-to-5 Fred Flintstone Fordist model of work, which is hopelessly outdated. Many of us have been working from home for a long time, or working virtually, or working part-time, working flexibly. So that's really premised on their notion of Fred Flintstone is going to work and Wilma, whatever, Wilma, his wife, is sitting home baking and cooking and looking after that child of theirs. Was it Bam Bam? You see how colonized I am. I know all of this stuff, very disturbing. But the whole notion of, what work is this really Fordist westernized model of the work model 9-to-5. And yet that is not the reality for many African economies. The reality is that 80% of people would not be considered as employed in the classical sense, but they are occupied. They're busy, they are sustaining themselves, they are exploring livelihoods. And I think this is also where the question of what well-being means and what a well-being economy means, which is nourishing, welcoming, and is also accommodating and centered on the realities of most people who work, become extremely important. I'd also think, I'd like to say a bit about states, because states have taken, states have different reputations depending on where you are. So authoritarianism, I think many of us have been very involved in talking about how authoritarianism and colonial capitalism have been manifested in this moment. So we've talked about we're looking at the bio-racism already. We're also looking at the way in which movement of people, who moves and who doesn't move, the alibi that has been used, disease control, who is and is not a carrier of disease, which of course are then ways of subterfuge, ways of smuggling in, really racist, sexist, patriarchal, xenophobic, toxic narratives, particularly between the global South and the global North, right? And of course, it's always worth mentioning that there are ongoing xenophobia, which is extremely toxic and extremely problematic. Now, how do we acknowledge that the exploitation of women historically, especially Black women, African women, historically, enables analysts to cost and recover the economic value of the labor that women do. So decolonial African feminism has been exposing the impact of these crises on healthcare, on individuals, on economies, and by highlighting pre-existing inequalities. And then these are associated with the intersectional pre-existing inequalities that particularly are faced by, for example, people of ethnic minorities, domestic workers, migrants, sex workers, and so on and so forth. And then there are other complexities in my context of people who are minority language speakers. And in my country, the language that I speak is not quite considered a minority, but it is not Zulu, it is not Xhosa. You probably have never even heard of the language that I speak. So there are these nuances that are brought to bear at national level, but they are part of an intersectional and also a very toxic colonial overflow and colonial hangover of divide and conquer. So these authoritarian and nationalistic politics that we've seen across the US with the now hopefully departed Trump, in Brazil, in France, in the UK, etc. And the ways in which that these also not only then highlight intersectional gendered vulnerabilities, but also patriarchally violent states and toxic forms of masculinized states. And it also exacerbates the growth in these authoritarian politics at state and sub-state levels, which are increasingly linked with nationalist rhetoric and nationalist policies. I think that just to move very quickly, then this debunks this whole notion of building back better, as I already mentioned. Another contribution that we're making making, I think, as in decolonizing, seeing this as a decolonial movement, is the reproductive economy. And this is really an integral part of realigning and reinscribing feminist aligned solidarity economies. Again, these could also be there are many nuances and many iterations of this, whether it's donut economies, solidarity economies, parallel economies, degrowth economies, and so on. So it's understood that the unpaid work that people do and community work is actually what assists the market economy in functioning. And yet we don't really speak to protect and to regenerate the ecological capacities to reproduce all forms of life. So this work of reproduction is just so much more than washing socks and cooking. It's actually about reproducing ideas. It's about reproducing courage, reproducing hope, reproducing ethics. It's about reproducing languages and the effort that it takes to teach our children new languages, not only linguistically, but the languages of resistance, the languages of democracy, the languages of body sovereignty, and so on and so forth. All of these things have to happen intentionally. So these sites of battle include attempts to nourish families, to nourish the soil, to insist on unpolluted air, unpolluted water, and so forth. So to reduce all of this to care work and to informalize it seems completely inadequate, because this is particularly where the labor has been done mainly by Black and brown women. It's considered to be infinite, and it's considered to be freely available to market orthodox economies for exploitation. Hence the whole rise in what I call people to state skills trafficking, quite frankly, and the ways in which states are able to barter and are willing to transact, low-paid workers between and amongst themselves. On a final note, I think that I'd like to also mention African feminist scholars like Amina Mama, like Patricia McFadden, like Pumla Gola, like Edith Paswani, and so many others who helped me on my journey every day, like Linka Bula as well, who's now the first vice chancellor of the largest university in South Africa, the UNISA. And I think that it is important to name them as part of the cohort, because not only have they been able to critique over many years that the idea that primitive accumulation is not the way to do economics, they're also then helping us to rethink the idea of ecological commodities as well. I think I'll leave it right there before I get one of those very polite ups. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that amazingly comprehensive presentation, which I will not begin to try to say anything summary about, but I do just want to say that the part where you're ending, or almost ending, where the talking about really the challenges, I think, for us as feminists of the ways in which care work itself, that on the one hand, we're trying to raise this up and say, this is what the economy depends on, and it's been ignored. But on the other hand, it's too easy to have too limited an understanding of what care work is, and for people who hear the term to have too limited an understanding of what it is. So that, and definitely building back better versus building forward radical. I'm going to take that forward. So thank you so much. Moving on to our last speaker, our fourth panelist is Dr. Mariama Williams. She's a feminist economist with over 20 years of experience working on economic development, macroeconomics, international trade, external debt, and global finance, with a focus on gender equality, women's empowerment, social equity, sustainable finance, and climate change issues. Her most recent publications include a chapter on a reflection on A View from the North, Gender and Energy Poverty in the European Union, and 3 decades of climate migration, why haven't we bent the global emissions curve? And another one on Africa's trade and environment policy. Her books include Gender and Climate Finance, Coming Out of the Margins, Gender Issues in the Multilateral Trading System, and Trading Stories, Experiences with Gender and Trade. She's director of the International Law and Economics, of the Institute of Law and Economics in Jamaica, a member of the Caribbean Feminist Action Network, the Gender and Trade Coalition, a principal of the Integrated Policy Research Institute, and managing director of From the Inside to the Outside LLC, promoting wellness, wisdom, and human potentials. She has been the a member of and founding member of so many different networks. I'm not going to try to go through all of them. I'll just say that now she is a member of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development and is looking forward to working more closely with the Dawn Network. So with that, let me turn it over to Mariama to talk to us about integrating mindfulness, social sustainability, and just transitions issues into national and global climate and economic policy in practice.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night maybe to some. Thank you all for joining this very interesting panel discussion. And I think I might have been strategically naive to come last because I don't think I can follow any of what went on before in terms of the analytical rigor, the feistiness of the presentation and delivery, but I will try my best. So thank you so much. Thank you, Carol and Melissa. Thanks, Ellie and Corinna and Leopoldo for a really wonderful presentation. I am going to kind of meander a bit with my stuff. I won't have a formal structured presentation or even an academic one because I'm wandering through a bunch of stuff that I'm thinking through. First, as with everyone, I would like to acknowledge that currently I'm sitting here in West Palm Beach, Florida, Palm Beach County, in the unceded territory of the Jaega people who Ponce de Leon met when he first arrived in these parts of the world in 1519. And also the Seminoles who still are here and managing to eke out a living in the narrow space with which they're now contained by the rampant movement of capitalism. The other thing that I wanted to acknowledge is that South Florida, which is considered by many Caribbean theorists of the plantation school. And the plantation economy school was one of the big discussion out of the Caribbean in the 1970s, 60s, and 80s, led by Lloyd Best, Carrie Levitt, who is the daughter of Polly Levitt, and Vanessa James, and a whole host of Caribbean scholars who theorized that this plantation economy really was this stretch from the Rio Grande do Sul in eastern Brazil to the Mason-Dixie line and outliers in the Indian Ocean and the island, the Reunion and Mauritius, that is structured around plantation slavery and specialization and export of primary commodity, which has marked the evolution of the society and has certainly marked the people, including the governance. So it's left a legacy of institution structures and behavior pattern of the plantation system that are really entrenched into our governance framework, our very lives and the way we live our lives today. A lot of this work around the plantation school, which has since not been as active amongst Caribbean economists who have become very Western orientated. The last great figure passed away a couple of years ago, Norman Gervin, who did quite a lot of work on the transnational cooperation, seeing it, projecting it as an institution that exists within the rules of the game of the plantation economy. And of course, we could trace the roots of many of these current corporations back to slavery and certainly in the Caribbean and the West, British domination, their control and ownership and continued repatriation of profits, especially aluminum and alumina back to the center countries, the metropole. So the plantation economy really provides a background for some of the things that I've been thinking about. As of the last 2 years, I've been doing a master's of science in yoga therapies, and which picked up on a great pastime of mine all my life, which has been to look at mindfulness and yoga and integrate that into my life. And I'm at that stage where I'm kind of trying to integrate that. So what I'm presenting is very, very tentative and very theoretical. Not theoretical, but very tentative and very empirical, I would say, in a lot of ways. I don't think we are missing we're in a time period of a dearth of alternative models. I think there's so many alternative economic models here. We even on just in this discussion alone, there's so many that came out. There's some that people are deriving out of their lived experience in the Caribbean, in eking out lifestyle. There's some that people are articulating in Asia and Africa and America. What's missing, I think, is that none of the models that we as feminists aspire to or discuss or talk about. Hang on a minute, sorry. Oh, somebody's knocking at my door. Okay, I am so sorry. I knew that would happen. Okay, done. So I begin to kind of articulate some of how these things that we don't claim and we don't have dominance or governance in any of the institutions that are policy making, policy deriving, or which governments and their advisors or technocrats listen to. And so the question for us is, how do we as feminists projecting, revising, projecting new forms of leadership, new kinds of models, get to be in those spaces and get to really make the changes so that we're not always tinkering at the margin of reforming capitalism, hopefully hoping that with the next crisis, during the financial crisis, we thought there was a crack that could be explored. And after the crisis, of course, the crack got cemented and global capital got even further entrenched and embedded and protected and ensured that they would be protected in any more future crisis by central banks, creating money out of fictional processes. And here we are, COVID crisis. Again, we are again imagining that somehow out of this crisis, we will see new changes and new direction. I posit that we will not. The mantra of building back better is a mantra of going back to where we were. What we've seen is a consistent pattern of going back historically to the same set and modes of tools and techniques to address climate. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think right now, for me, in some sense, I've been thinking of this, is this a Kairos moment, a turning point? Across the globe, societies are facing the triad crisis of the pandemic, climate, and the persistent economic inequality and global resistance, again, rising in terms of racism along many different poles. In the US, Black Lives Matter, but also you see a tenacity and a resistance arriving in Brazil and other places, undergirding that. So, and there are real concerns by capital about disorderly transitions, which is what they're calling a lot of this, disorderly transition, mainly in relation to climate, but also in relation to getting back from the COVID-19. We're not out of the woods with COVID-19. As you can see, we have vaccine recalls and various kind of stumble blocks along the way. So this is not ending in a nice way, a controlled way, the way that they were able to control the exit from the financial crisis. This is going to be going on for quite some time. And so we then have to really put our forces together and begin to think. And for me, one of the really interesting starting point is, can we join together with diverse forces, both in the climate justice movement, who are talking the narrative of just transitions, not just transition. Just transition was a labor union mantra to break open the climate silo and talk about how to prevent adverse economic consequences for workers. We are now talking about just transitions, which is the just transitions for Indigenous people, women, ethnic minorities, for the global South, for all of us who are entitled to global atmospheric space, global wealth, physical and material, global knowledge, global technology that's been derived out of our backs and from the long history of colonialism and even pre-colonialism. We can go back to look at the contribution of African, Egypt, and other cultures to the rise of what is undergirding capitalism today. And for me, one of the interesting things about this narrative about just transition is the linkage with what's going on in local communities, that many local communities are now beginning to look at their resources, beginning to push the the levers of power to begin to question, begin to see, and to question what is going on. I think the COVID pandemic, as everyone has said, has shown such a harsh light on the abject failure of capitalism, the capitalist growth model, to really protect, even in the developed countries, public sector health, public health, much less in the developing countries, employment, social security, and so forth. And we see that even in these countries, the bulwark of the essential work is being done by people of color, primarily women, but people of color everywhere. So that I think this is, to me, in my mind, presenting a moment for us to begin to think. We see from different areas in the social and science and physical and science, we see a whole network and a lot of work on trauma, right? Intergenerational trauma, collective trauma, and all of the various things, looking at how it is that as human beings, we all have these scars of trauma that impact our behavior, blocking progress and transformation. So unless we are able to begin to unearth those and begin to look at those, certainly in the Caribbean, it's very clear, right? That this plantation economy, the slave mentality, the slave system that we have is a blockage to our leaders to move forward. Unexamined and left to be to continue to foster, we remain enslaved to our debt, and I use our in very actualized way, to debt, to a development model that has so far failed almost 90% of the people. If you look in the Caribbean to see who are the people who have gained from capitalism, those are the planter class and the inheritors of the planter class. They're the ones who own all of the commanding heights of any of the Caribbean economy. Jamaica, Barbados, we have people that look like me in government. They're not in control of the economies. You look at who control those economies. So unless we have a serious rethinking and relooking at how we are, and our technology is fast advancing about beyond our sense of self, our operation as human, our consciousness is not evolving in the way that in consonant with the technology and the tools that we have. So for me, that calls to rethinking and relooking and engaging with forces, indigenous people who still have a sense of the consciousness of the world, that the world belongs to every being, including the plants, the trees, the water. All of this are not owned. They're not there for us to exploit. They are part of human heritage. They're part of what we use efficiently and the best we can. We nurture and pass on to the next generation. It's not an acquisitive culture. And I think we need to really go back to look at some of those ethnic and indigenous phraseology, cosmology, and also look at what's going on in terms of the Buddhist approach and the linkage of mindfulness. Now, mindfulness are a mindful approach to how we do policy and economics. Now, there are some people within the economics discipline, and certainly within climate change, there's been some attempt to look at how mindfulness or mindful approach can impact our sense as consumers, right? So you shift, then you're no longer a consumer. You are now a human being, a man or a woman with a consciousness about where you are and your place in the world and what you're here to do, and how you manage that then becomes the focus, not on simply going to work, not on maximizing profit. Within economics, you also see some discussion of it, which I find very, very enlivening. So we have a lovely set of articles coming out of almost many years ago, right? So we have, sorry, I've kind of lost my train here, but we have, yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I've
already exhausted my time. Okay, so
transition into the discussion part and then hopefully pick up on a lot of these in that part. Thank you so much.
Mariama, did you want to end a sentence?
Oh, no, I'll come back. I will come back to it. Yes, I think I'm pretty good. I think I put out what it is that I wanted to say, not in a very elegant way, but I still think thoughts that I'm still working through. So I appreciate the time to throw them out here for discussion.
Yeah, no, completely compelling. Thank you. All right, then let me now turn to all four of you and ask you, there were so many both connections and disjunctures between what you were saying, whether any of you would like to turn and either ask one of the other panelists a question or pick up an idea or reflect on a contrast, any of the above. Ellie, you're unmuted. Do you want to start?
Sure. I just have I really appreciated what everyone said, and especially your commitment, Leibohong, to this transitional change. I mean, it's really lovely to hear your compulsion to work on this and all that you're already doing. In response to Mariama's remark, which is true, that we find ourselves outside the corridors of power. And I think there's various ways to think about that. We're outside the corridors of a power structure that we don't even want to be inside. We are doing something different. And that structure of power, by externalizing and not measuring and refusing to acknowledge what Corinna called the bottom, quoting Maria Mias, the bottom of that iceberg, you know, the foundation, the women's work and the unpaid work and the ecological vibrancy that holds up humanity, is not seen by those corridors of power, is not, you know, being handled well at all. And yet, and the fact that we're still here, the fact that we're still doing what we do, and Leibohong, you talked about it too, the informal occupations that are not even seen as work. We are part of a movement and a group of people in our generation that is acknowledging the importance of those things. When Nancy Fulbray says patriarchy is on the decline because it doesn't recognize care and unpaid work, it's an indication that those structures are not stable structures. Those structures are falling. And those of us who recognize what is really important and who knows that it's shared well-being that really is the crucial, that names the goal of not just economies, because the word economy is also too limited, but of human existence, really. Well-being is about the relationships, the reciprocity. It's not about us as workers. It's going, you know, working 9 to 5, consumption, even wealth, what is recognized as wealth. And so this, see, Mary Mellor is one of the earliest feminist ecological economists. Her book, dating back to 1997, you know, sort of named all of this in the first place. And now, and her latest work is about local money. She's talking about how if money is what opens the door to economies, then people can create that. They can control it. They can use money for their own purposes. It doesn't have to be in the hands of private banks, which is the way it is now nearly everywhere. So I just want to throw that out. I mean, I think what we need is to think about how are we going to use our efforts to strengthen this alternative view, this resurgence of shared well-being, rather than trying vainly to get into those corridors of power, which are rapidly falling down.
Corinna, why don't you go ahead, and I'll just invite any of you who want to be responding to just jump in.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to follow up on what Ellie has just said, and on what Leopoldo has raised in her intervention also. So this question of what is work actually, and how from a feminist point of view we can broaden or we can abolish the work is wage work, equalization and narrative. And I think one thing we have seen in neoliberal capitalism is that the main strategy was to make the hidden visible by giving it monetary value, by shifting it to markets, for example, by saying like, okay, if it's beyond the surface of the iceberg, let's move it up, let's move this boundary up. And we have seen, I think that this strategy has in large parts failed really, because what we've seen is that what has been shifted and many times is valorized, but it's not valued. So I think we really need to, like, this holds, I think, especially true for marketized care, where very often we see that it's systematically underpaid. We see that it's often pressured for profitability and for efficiency. And also with regard to public provisioning, like we have a lot of this here in Europe. It's really noteworthy that European welfare states, they are deeply colonial, they are patriarchal, they reproduce also heteronormativity. So I think we also should talk about, especially also from like a degrowth kind of view, how we can actually value care without valorizing it. How do we maybe decouple wage work from livelihood security? How do we create more time, because people spend less time in wage work, and not only privileged people spend less time in wage work, but it's reducing working time and wage work for everyone in order to revalue all those unpaid forms of work without necessarily valorizing some. So I think this is also one of the questions I would really like to talk about more. And I totally agree with what all of you've been saying on there's really just no back to normal. Like we've really seen we have to build back better, because normal really was the problem. It was normality was based on extractive capitalism, on colonialism, on patriarchy, and we really have to try to do better. And maybe this time is the time.
If I can just jump in there, if I may, Carol and others. So just dovetailing on what both Ellie and Corinna have said, also the notion that, yeah, what is work, but also what then does it mean for, you know, I think what some people have called, you know, these handmaidens of capitalism. And it really, they're these tropes that keep reappearing. And these tropes that productivity is to do with how much waged labor has to be extracted from us. I'd like to kind of posit a question as to whether we can transition away from, and how to transition away from the really market orthodox neoliberal model of extractivism, recognizing that there's more than enough wealth to go around. We know this. I mean, 3 white men have more money than they'll ever spend, them, their children, their children's children, their extended families will ever spend in a million years. So we know that it's not a resource thing. It's a distribution thing, and it's also an access thing. It's the people who has the power to leverage that access, and who has the access to leverage that power. And that again is framed within again, questions of decoloniality, extractivism, also whose lives matter. So I wonder, I would really like us to expand the notion of Black Lives Matter as a Pan-African call, as a decolonial Pan-African and new economics call, because not only lives in relation to police brutality, but certainly globally, forms of state brutality. We just yesterday, 2 days ago, we were commemorating the death of an activist 10 years ago called Andreas Tatane. And I think, unfortunately, the imbalance of international news means that we get more coming in than it filters out. So I'm gonna take this gap and really invite you to go and read up on him. But it's really important to make these linkages, and his point of departure and his rallying cry was around basic access to service delivery, to water, to electricity in a very low income community in Free State. And South Africa is, littered with many of these community insurrections, which are what? They're basically a cry for personhood. They're basically a cry for well-being. They're basically a cry for the state to keep its promises that it has made in the constitution. And they're really a resistance to the authoritarianism of states. And I think that can we take the opportunity now to really draw the parallels between authoritarianism and how we dismantle those forms of authoritarianism, both in the global South and in the global North.
Is there anyone who, Mariama.
I was just going to say a reading that I came across this week, and a quote which I've been using quite a lot, because I think it reflects on this idea that we're going to build back better, because there's no better to go back to. because the troubles we're facing, and it's this guy, Joel Magnus, right? He wrote Mindful Economics as a pathway, right? That the troubles we face now are not the result of a good system gone awry, but rather a system that is built to do exactly what it is doing. Corporations are designed to reap profits for their shareholder at any cost. Work is designed so that people are dehumanized and are forced into circumstances where their lives are stressed and they must continue on that like a little rabbit or a rat in a maze. So we have to first recognize that this system is the problem, right? The way we define work, productivity, the mantras that Leibohong has mentioned, all of these are kind of the magic that are used to justify capitalism, right? Efficiency and all. But these are the tools that we see being used time and time again. The response to critical moment to downplay or to dampen rising expectations about a better path or a different path are the same that they've always used. And I think we as academics, as activists, have to stand up in the path and say, no, we cannot continue talking about work, productivity, profit, maximization in the other way. We need to center, we have to address two fundamental problems: environmental degradation, the rampant pace of technology that is leaving us behind, and the dehumanization of the majority of persons on Earth who are Black, Indian, and people of color. And that until we start doing that, and begin to place at the center of our analysis the capacities, our human capacities, our reframing of who we are, and acknowledging the trauma that capitalism has created, both for Black people and white people, and what that means in terms of our response and our capacity to move forward to create a sustainable planet and a sustainable life-affirming place. We're always going to be playing catch-up, tinkering on the outside of this system. This is not a broken system. This is a system that's working the way it's meant to work, and it goes through hiccups, as we even in our daily lives go through hiccups. Our bodies are perfectly meant to perform the way they are, and various times they may have various shortcomings because of what we do, but the system itself is working perfectly. There is no interest in changing the system because the system is seen to be the system that will carry us through.
Well, this does bring us, I think, to maybe the question that hovers over all of this, which is, on the one hand, I think that all of us are in agreement that, yes, the system is working the way it was meant to, and it is not remediable. It needs to be transformed. But then what strategies do we have to do that? Okay. It's I think that at least a couple of you have talked about better forms of governance, right? I mean, not abandoning the state, but saying the state needs to be different, but also maybe the state isn't the only form of governance that we need to be relying on now. And there's also been some talk, Leibohong was talking about the way in which, decolonial perspectives can be themselves recolonized. And, we already see so much around the climate, so much of the language from the climate justice movement being captured into this system in which it is not serving the purpose it's meant to, and so on. So it just really raises the question, I think, that I want to ask all of you about, what do you think then our strategy needs to be? An ongoing conversation that we have at the consortium is about whether there's any such thing as non-reformist reforms, whether you can, once you try to translate an alternative vision into policy, which by definition where we are now means working policy within a policy institution that already exists, which is already not working toward those ends, is it possible to actually create reforms that transform at the same time? And if so, what would some of them be, or is it not possible? So for any of you and the kind of model that you have been discussing and envisioning, is there such a thing as a reform that would be, or a set of reforms that would be transformative?
You know, I think that we go back to the old discussion about tactics and strategies in organizing. Certainly, we start from this common place. And we know that we're not going to be able to leverage ourselves from here to nirvana without going through steps and stages. Therefore, we have to be very strategic, both practically and analytically, about how we move forward. But I think we have to ground that movement, whether it's analytical or practical, in the movement of struggles on the ground. Right? So we have to first recognize where people are, those who are struggling to transform or change their livelihood, and share that up and help to build an analysis that's based on that in moving forward, right? I don't think that a lot of what we normally do, I'm not sure how to say that. I won't go there. I think that has to be the starting point. And I think we have to begin to start thinking about how we ourselves behave as individuals, right? As well as how we behave in our institutions and how the institutions behave. We have women and gender studies programs that are just like male economics department in many places, right? So we have got to start cleaning up our houses as feminists, as gender experts and gender advocates. And we start working at those levels and giving voice, as you are doing with this program, to people of color who are out there pushing, joining in the struggles where people are struggling, putting their lives on the line, literally in many cases, right, for a better life. And we have to, so we build that. Just, you know, it's like going back to the 1940s, 50s, 60s struggle. You know, it's not going to be solved. We're not going to solve that quickly, and we're not going to solve it strictly by doing what we've always done. Because I don't think that's moved us really far in the last 30 years that I have been involved in that. We've gotten co-opted. So now we have pink washing, green washing. We now talk about feminist foreign policy. I mean, you know, we just keep coming up with tactics and strategy inside that very narrow framework that is not very useful or affirming the lives of people on the ground. And I think we need to step back a bit and maybe think through and have some serious discussions with people who are on the ground, who are on the front line, working on some of these issues. Doesn't mean we stop doing all that we've been doing or it's irrelevant, but there comes a time when you have to ask yourself, what am I doing? And is what I'm doing perpetuating the system or actually making pathways through or around it?
Thank you. I was typing and therefore not looking up to see who raised their hand first, but maybe let's start with that figure.
I think Corinna was first, but
sorry.
I want to say that I agree with you, Mariama. Wow, that's absolutely true. And this is, I think that undoing patriarchy, undoing racism, undoing colonialism have to be top priorities, because those create the possibility for the kinds of coalitions and working together that you mentioned before. And sometimes that can be done from within the state, but most often it's done by activists, it's done by people in the street, it's done by people in communities, and it's done by raising up the voices and listening to the voices of people who have that as their priority. I think that you're right, that we need to figure out what we can do that's outside of government structures, because like I do believe that those structures are not, I don't want to be putting my effort into maintaining those structures. So you can look, for example, you can ask yourself questions like, is this initiative advancing collective property, not private property, not state property? Is it working for the common good, in some sense? Meaning, is it participatory? Are people engaging with each other to figure out what the common good is and trying to make it so? That is usually happening outside state structures and outside policy structures. You can ask the question, is this initiative building skills for conflict resolution, for open-minded, empirical, collaborative decision-making across diverse worldviews and land pedagogies? You can ask, is it opening institutions? Is it cracking ceilings and boundaries? Is it taking down walls? You can ask, does it help to destabilize those concepts of justice, economies, development, all of those words that have been co-opted and have become false goals and things that have been taken over by the structures that have been, as you say, designed exactly to do what they're doing. And you can ask the question, does this start with local needs, and does it ensure local community level guidance? We can all make our communities stronger. We can all build those relationships and the reciprocity and the land-based recognition that allows us to be doing something that's outside the state, outside the market, and is working together to make this resurgence of shared well-being possible. And I just want to say one other thing in terms of climate. There's more and more research coming out that shows that equitable societies, that equity, redistribution actually also accomplishes climate goals in the long run, especially if you look at the big picture. So this is not something that is able to be postponed for reasons of, the climate emergency. It actually furthers us in addressing the climate emergency. Thanks.
Thank you, Karina.
Yeah, I think Ellie and Mariama have already pointed out so many important strategies, and like just to follow up a bit, for me, like one framework when I'm thinking about strategies of transformation, which is really useful for me, is Nancy Fraser, who's kind of saying there are affirmative strategies that work within a given structure, and then there are transformative strategies that really aim at changing the structure itself. But one thing she also says is that very many times, like, there are affirmative struggles that give rise to transformative effects, like in the sense of non-reformist reforms, as you've called them, or also in the sense of concrete utopias or revolutionary realpolitik. So I think that is a really important question of thinking about the horizon, which I think many of us agree upon, like we need to move towards this new horizon, and we don't want to go there top down, but we want to go there bottom up. But what are maybe bottom linked strategies where maybe, for example, certain policies could allow for, I'm also, like, in the degrowth discourse, we're discussing a lot about caring commons, about organizing care as commons. And I think there are many policies, like policies that aim at decoupling wage labor from livelihood security or working time reduction, that enable those things to flourish, but without saying like the state or government policies are the main vehicle of transformation or anything, but just saying, okay, those could be the little things, like if designed in the right way, they could somehow be like very concrete steps towards like this bigger transformation. And with regard to the comments, that's a bit of a different comment I wanted to make before, also on Ellie's presentation, which I found also really, really interesting. I just wanted to add that I think that when we're talking about care as commons today, like we're talking a lot of time, like, okay, so commons are being recreated, for example, by the degrowth movement in the global north. But I think it's super important to acknowledge that in many countries, or for example, in societies that haven't had the historical privilege of a welfare state, like they have been carrying commons all along, like there have been those commons that have survived modern and colonial intrusion and that are based on different political ecologies and logics of care. So I think while in a mainstream development discourse, those are so often seen as are invisibilized or seen as local, as irrelevant, as backwards. That's actually where we need to look, and where we need to turn this epistemic violence of seeing some, invisibilizing some kind of around and say like, okay, there's actually so much to learn, and there's actually so much already there in various sites. Like one of the best papers I've read all last year, I think, was by Nina Banks, who's been theorizing on Black women in the United States and unpaid collective work, theorizing the community as a site of production, saying that in a lot of feminist economics, what's happening is like, we're always talking about, oh yeah, unpaid care work happens in private household, but that's not what's happening. If we're looking to unpaid care work in a lot of Black communities, it's been this collective care work. We're now saying like, we need to recreate all along. So I think there are so many places to start and to talk about strategies to try to find those bottom link transformations that start from the bottom after all.
Thank you. We have some questions that are coming in from the audience. So Leibohong, I'm going to give you the last word before we turn to audience questions.
Thanks, Carol. I'll be as quick as possible. So I think I want to just dovetail exactly on concrete ideas and wins, I suggest. So the one is, I think, acknowledging positionality and this and recognizing that a lot of the economic orthodoxy is embedded in white supremacy, and I think personal positionality is really important, as well as then what are the consequences of taking responsibility for that. And I mean, race capitalism and feminist economics are my two favorite tools of analysis. What about if basic things like canceling student debts would be one way of really ensuring that we're not entering, we don't have a whole generation of young people who are entering the workforce already indebted. And that's right, that's part of the whole trick of capitalism, right? So I have some of my nieces and nephews who are graduating from medical school, and they're immediately being offered these ridiculous, BMWs and Mercedes and these ridiculous, being forced into indebtedness in the name of prestige, basically. The second piece of that is, I think an important cross-sectional, international lobby towards free equality healthcare. I don't think that has to be a thing, in my view. If we're going to redefine what work is, we also need to redefine what care is, and we need to also recognize, states must recognize that quality care is really important. And lastly, I'd like us to point to Brazil. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and of course going through its own ebbs and flows politically at the moment. And I think a recession of some of the really important gains made under the Lula administration, but nonetheless offers really, I think it's always good to look for hope, right? So offers some interesting case studies on the use of taxes. I think they use like 35% of GDP to raise taxes and to close down in a significant way, and in less than a generation, the poverty indices, to close down the poverty indices quite significantly. And I think when I look back to the ways in which many African states and Latin American states were hammered by structural adjustment, right? We were doing a lot of the stuff. I think a historicization of how we got to this situation, how we came to be extracted, even the extractivism of what we were able to do for ourselves is really important, because that also feeds into these frankly quite racist, condescending views on what development is being developed at top down, north to south. And I think that a lot of that is in the undoing. And I think I go back to what I said about the importance of very tactful allyhood, which doesn't feed into being part of the problem as well.
Thank you so much. Melissa, do you want to come in with questions? from the audience?
Sure. So, so I think some of them people have actually typed out answers, which was really wonderful. So I'll try not to ask those questions again, but if anyone does want to speak to anything that they did type out, that would be great, just to kind of bring that to the attention of the rest of the audience. But the one question that I feel like sort of builds right off of Leibohong's last point was a question from Kate Bancroft, which is about how do we see the approaches towards dismantling the system shift depending on location? How do we reconcile the globalized need for change with the need for locational specificity in dismantling localized, semi-nuanced manifestations of capitalism? And this question of not just replacing one type of hegemony with another type of hegemony. And I don't know if anyone has any specific kind of thoughts around sort of reconciling the need for a global movement and the utility of having this global feminist movement that is working on these questions with the need for the locational specificity of how capitalism actually plays out and interacts with you know, post-war contexts or anything like that. So that's where I'll start.
I could just say that I think that the only way you build a movement that changes governance structures is locally. You have to start locally, and you have to, because it's only the people that live in a particular place that know the political context and also the ecological context and also the social context to be able to build a strategy for addressing what's going on. Because violence manifests itself locally. Food shortages manifest themselves locally, and water shortages. And how people organize themselves to deal with those things and to overcome the barriers that are put in their way to deal with those, as they try to deal with those things, that's about local politics. The reason I think that the local becomes the global, or that, you know, that part depends on interpersonal connections. For example, in Toronto, there are many people who live in this city whose parents and certainly their grandparents were born in Ethiopia or Cameroon or Brazil or Vietnam, and they have connections, personal connections, so that they know what's happening in those other places. And so they can see the connections between local struggles here and the local struggles that are happening there. And they can see the impacts of the climate extremes and the chaos and the crisis in other places, because they know personally what's happening. So those kinds of connections, when you build on that with education for others, as people know each other, they hear the stories. When someone says to you, my grandmother got COVID in Addis Ababa and I'm really concerned about her, you know, this is the way that from the grassroots, global change can happen. We live in a world now where it's possible to communicate across the globe. And so I think that there are synergies that happen across multi-scales. I don't know what others think.
Did anyone else want to speak to that particular question? Oh, Mariama, you want me to do it?
I'm okay. I'm complete.
Okay. Well, I will move on to another one. So this question came from Sam Bartlett, and I think was sort of specifically directed at Corinna, but then I think is also, they said, was open to the rest of the panel as well, and was this question about how the UN Sustainable Development Goals and their neoliberal co-option as an answer to global ills can be challenged in everyday life when those ideas and those sorts of goals have become so normalized in how nonprofits function and how we talk about sort of strategy, et cetera, like how in an everyday life that that can be dislodged. And I think that actually ties right in with what Ellie was just saying about really starting from the grassroots, but I think there's a question of how that happens in everyday life.
Yeah, so I can start. So I think the question is really one of it's really a question we're kind of raising in degrowth, in the sense that degrowth can be said kind of to be a second wave of radical ecological growth critique. Like there was this first wave in the 1970s when it was said, okay, economic growth is fundamentally incompatible with sustainability. And then, as we all know, like with the sustainable, with the Brundtland reports, this whole notion of sustainable development came up. And then suddenly it was like, okay, no, basically there is a compatibility. We can have like economic growth, social well-being, and environmental justice in the same framework. And census even got further to, oh, it's not only basically compatible, but basically we can also have green growth. We can have growth for sustainability. So degrowth in a way really challenges us and goes back to saying, no, we cannot have this three-pillar diagram of sustainability saying it's all possible, because basically what's happening is that we as a society are fundamentally embedded in our natural surroundings and in planetary boundaries, and the economy is fundamentally embedded in society. So I think that's how we best challenge it, by seeing this fundamental embeddedness and this fundamental interrelations, and seeing that the economy, it's like the smallest of the three circles. It's not the same size of a pillar, and we shouldn't overstress it. It's important so much in all those discussions we're having about transformation, like saying, yeah, we would, but then this would cost jobs. We should say, like, okay, if there are not enough jobs, why don't we do work sharing? Why don't we share the work there is among all of us, like, equally? So I think kind of trying to counteract this primacy given to economic concerns is one of the things we should do.
Can I just hop in there as well, just and dovetail, piggyback on what Corinna is saying? You know, a lot of the critiques around the SDGs almost flow from the critiques on the MDGs. Now, I remember writing a piece years ago, and I'm trying to recall off the top of my head, but I mean, one of the things that we're very concerned about at the time was that it did seem to be a reenactment of a form of structural adjustment and really sanitizing the idea of what internationalism is. And in fact, really reappropriating one of the things I was speaking about, reappropriating development language in ways that are quite toxic and which favor a few, the few triad states, right? And I mean, if we remember at the time that the MDGs were really a series of compromises and contestations, like many of these multilateral agreements, right? And, very co-optive. And what I do remember very clearly was that one of the key requirements was open markets. And it's almost like this really faded small print in the midst of having, dealing with child mortality, dealing with education, reducing poverty, all the really good, fluffy, important stuff. But the clause to that is that there must be a buy-in of neoliberal economics. And I think that the states that resisted this, again, were being drawn back into being structurally adjusted. And what I do recall as well around the MDGs was that it was about, again, the state not being the state absenting itself from state business. And of course, what happens in the vacuum are corporate interests, the corporatization of states. And this included, of course, the privatization of lands, indigenous lands, of historical lands, and so forth. Also included the unfettered control and opening up deregulation that states were forbidden in principle from even adjudicating over international tender principles. And this whole coherence agenda, which was the big thing in the late 90s through the noughties when I first came into this work, feels like 1,000 years ago. But, this whole thing about the coherence agenda between the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, including instruments like the MDGs. And I know people like Mariama, who were my elders and pillars in these debates, can probably say more. But I do think that the SDGs are yet another iteration and yet another incarnation of this. And I know that a lot of women from the Global South have written really fantastic critiques, questioning that, again, even though the SDGs say that this is about reducing inequality and disparity between states, what does that actually look like? What does that feel like? What does that taste like when the framing is still in the same market orthodox dogma? So I'm very, very, very suspicious of these multilateralism, which is in fact unilateralism, which is actually, you know, co-option and colonialism of policy instruments at the behest of a few states who have more voice or more resources to have their way.
Corinna, is the hand up because you wanted to respond to that, or was that from before?
From before, I guess.
Okay. And Ellie or Mariama, oh, Ellie, you unmuted yourself.
I'm waiting for Mariama to jump in and answer these things, but I just wanted to say one very quick thing in response to an earlier question about how the global north can create change without simply replacing hegemony. I think the global north has a lot to work on in the global north with regard to reducing those carbon emissions, with regard to taxing the rich in a fair way and redistributing that that income in ways that actually benefit people, and with regard to creating the technologies that can be used at the local level to reduce drudgery and create the possibility of energy options for not just the marginalized people in the global north, but that can be spread if desired to the rest of the world. So there's plenty that we can do that doesn't have anything to do really with hegemony. It has to do with cleaning up our own house.
At this point, I am so sorry to say we have had some incredible questions come in the Q&A. Thank you so much to our audience members for putting them in there. And I am so sorry that we're not able to get to them all. But just because we are nearing the end, and I know that we want to have time for each panelist to say a couple of final things, I am going to turn it back over to Carol at this point. But thank you to everyone for putting the questions in, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. And again, thank you to everybody in the audience who was sending such good questions. I'm not going to ask each of you to summarize what you said. What you said was so rich. The question more at this point is, here's your last minute or two for what you would really like people to take away from this, what you'd like them to leave this event thinking about. And as soon as anybody is ready to speak, just feel free.
While my colleagues are mulling, I'll jump right in if I may. I think the one is that we have to rethink language, we have to rethink positionality, work inwards, work from the inside out, because our basic inherent prejudices and biases, and that's white patriarchal masculinity, is reflected in the economy. The second is pieces that I think anything can be dismantled. I think that bailouts we need to rethink bailouts. I think the people's bailout, we need to rethink bailouts that respond to the economic crisis. And we need to really demand that our states deploy their considerable monetary and fiscal power to mobilize resources that can rescue pieces of the economy that reside with Black and brown people, that protect Black women's jobs, that protect people's livelihoods, that nourish those pieces, not banks, not the reckless, not those folks. And lastly, I would like to suggest that a feminist alternative really starts from the premise that investments in households, in well-being, in human well-being as a new ethic, as an important building forward radical ethic, is the real basis of sustainability, and not in an OECD, UN, shaded, co-opted kind of way, but in a people-centered way, in the way that people like Indira Gandhi, talked about sustainability, in the way that, a lot of leaders like Nkrumah spoke about sustainability and sovereignty in that kind of context. So really making sovereignty fashionable again in the best possible way, especially for states in the global South.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a lot.
Yeah, Mariama, go ahead.
A lot to think about. There's some very quite good questions and situations, such as the person who said that they went into government because they were fed up with how NGOs and others behave, but they would like to still work on transformation. I think there are quite a lot of people like that in institutions, many of the institutions that we work with. But because they don't speak our language, we tend to ignore them or don't see that capacity. So I think for me, first part is to recognize how I'm behaving, right? Because I create chaos and trauma around me and with people who I am interacting if I'm not mindful of what I'm doing and how I'm saying. So that do not recreate within your organization the things that we are struggling against. So you need to look at the organization, look at who is sitting next to you, who's around you, right? Who are you organizing with? I think those are fundamental issues. Do we make alliance with people who don't speak the language that we speak? Or they don't speak academic language, they don't speak struggle language? Do we have those kinds of alliances? Because it's not about each of us going out and doing everything, but it's to have that awareness and that alignment with different groups of people. I also have a challenge about the global South, because I'm not sure that there is a global South that's undifferentiated, homogeneous. So I think we also need to rethink some of those languages also, and see who are strategic allies, even within the Caribbean. We're questioning now that we have the CARICOM, we are supposed to have a single market, single economy, but if you end up from Jamaica and you end up in Barbados, you may or may not be let in based on the custom person's perception of what you look like or who you look like or your capacity to stay. So we have a lot of issues that we as individuals in our various career paths need to work on. And so our first job is not to create chaos ourselves and not to recreate the patterns that we're struggling against, to link arms and to be led in the struggle by those who are leading on the front lines. I think one of the things that possibly the only underlying goodness about the COVID virus is that it has brought to the fore who the workers are that are keeping the economy. It is not the stockbroker. It is not the baseball hero. It's the small mom and pop stores in community who keep open at risk of death. It is a nurse. It is the licensed practical nurse. It's the shoe key. It's all of the small people that we don't see. And so that's been one. The other lessons from the COVID is the way in which the state has been reinvented. Now the state, we know that in the financial crisis, the state came in and gave money to rescue, but now the state itself is part of the intellectual property process. So we need to push even on the vaccine, and whether or not you're vaccine skepticism, this apartheid that's going on, where despite the last 50 years of solidarity on the global front, the minute there was a vaccine for COVID, developed countries such as Canada and others went in and swoop more than enough for their population. Now the implementation may be problematic, but the fact is the first effect was to take care of self, right? US was blocking export control, and the EU also blocking medicine and other PPPs to go out to the developing world. This idea of global solidarity, all of these rhetorics that we talk about, who are defenders of human rights, we see all of that is open, right? And so we can no longer fool ourselves under the guise of, oh, these people are the human rights defenders, these are feminist defenders. They are not. And so I think we need to go back again to the drawing board and think about what it is that we are working for and who are our allies, and ground ourselves in work and struggles at the local level. Who in your universities? Who are the gardeners? Who are the janitors? Do you have a relationship with them, or do you just pass them by? I mean, this is all part of valuing and uplifting those around us, and then we move forward in struggle.
Thank you very much. Corinna, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for all those reflections. I think it's such an incredibly rich panel with all those co-panelists. I'm really deeply impressed by the conversation we're having. So I guess the main takeaway from my presentation is that basically we're having this multiple crisis I've been talking about, and I think we need to see that this crisis is kind of rooted in a very specific anthropocentric, monocultural, growth-oriented and patriarchal civilizational pattern. And so very often we're being offered easy solutions like green growth, like monetizing care. And those easy solutions are so many times pseudo solutions. They're based on technocratic, top-down, Western science-based. And I think that we should be done with looking for growth alternatives, for development alternatives, but we should really start looking for alternatives to growth and to development, like to all those deeply flawed concepts. And I think that degrowth is one of approaches that tries to challenge all those things. And I think degrowth needs to become more intersectional still. And when we're talking about care, I think that it is imperative to kind of embrace an perspective of really putting caring relations and the sustainability of life at the center of like how we envisage this new economic paradigm beyond the growth fetishism in a way. I hand over to Ellie.
Yeah, we're over time. I just wanted to say very quickly, and I think I typed this into some Q&A box, but it's about the human personality, which is humans often get afraid, and in times of risk like this, because of COVID and because of climate crisis, there is a tendency sometimes to retreat into this kind of individualized or, you know, clan oriented or racist or you know, defensive fear posture. And I think that a very important thing that needs to happen in order for the transformations that we're talking about to unroll is for people to have personal lived experience in how collective community building responses that minimize risk can actually overcome that fear, can help people see in their own experience that that collective solutions are possible and actually work, because that happens outside governments, and it helps to it helps not only to address those crises, but also to lay the foundations for a broader approach to the big challenges and intersectional challenges that we've been talking about. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All of today's presentations and the conversation that has come after was so rich. I feel like I need to go back, slow down, think things through, listen to them in relation to each other again. And I'm happy that we have the recording, and I'll just again say to everybody in the audience that if you want to go back, the recordings will be available. And also to remind people to please fill out their form, the little survey at the end. The main thing I want to say is I am so grateful to all of you, Leibohong, Corinna, Ellie and Mariama, for bringing your brilliance to us and engaging with each other. It's really been fantastic. I'm so grateful to have you here. And again, if we were in person now, everybody would be applauding and expressing their gratitude. We don't get to do that this way, but please imagine it in your mind, thunderous applause, people standing up, rushing up to the podium to talk to you afterward and engage you for the next 20 minutes when you really have to go someplace else, all of those things. So you have all of our admiration and gratitude. Thank you so much. And finally, I'll say that we will leave the chat open, and the consortium folks will be here for the next few minutes for anybody who wants to say anything else, ask anything else. But in the meantime, we will release our wonderful panelists, and thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank you so much, Carol. Thanks, everyone.
So much. It was great meeting you.
You. Stay in touch. Ciao.
Ciao.